this on? Okay. Hi, good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming. My name is Jeff Muellersbaugh. I'm the chairman of the Buildings Committee. I'd like to call the meeting to order. Can we have a motion to approve our agenda?
So moved.
Do we have a second?
Second.
Second. Oh, is our secretary here?
Yes,
Right here.
Oh, thank you. Okay. And all in favor? Aye. Okay. Attendance introduction. So I'm Jeff Muellersbaugh, the chairman of the committee.
I'm Liz Glidden, the town planner.
Joanne Nesty. Emily Carroll, committee member.
Jim?
I was expecting you. Jen Sweet.
Lisa Malloy.
Okay. Do we want the public to, or,
If they want to. Well, you know, we're gonna do public comment, so why don't we wait, and then if somebody has
Okay.
something that they wanna say, we'll get their name.
okay, great. And we have approval of the agenda twice. I believe that should be approval of the minutes.
Yeah.
We have minutes from the March 20th, 2018 meeting. Do we have a motion to approve those minutes?
So moved. Second.
Any discussion? All in favor? Aye. Okay. All right. And we have a presentation tonight on the Scovil Mill project. So Liz, if you'd like to introduce our guests.
Okay, do you wanna move public comments maybe to the end?
Yeah,
I
after
should've put it
the,
after the presentation.
yeah, after the presentation might be more appropriate. Okay.
I'm Liz Glidden, I'm the town planner, and the Buildings Committee has been working on some of our historic structures in town. We worked on a grant for the jail, and we used the same type of grant applied to the Department of Economic Development with the state to do a brownfield remediation grant or an assessment grant for the Scovil Ho building, which is the former DOT property. The town does not own this property yet. We're trying to partner with the state, and because it's such a vital part of our village and our downtown, we're, you know, we really want to be ambassadors for that site and do everything that we can to leverage additional funding or opportunity to see that site redeveloped in a positive and responsible way. So, part of what we've done is to have a phase one done and to look at some possible alternatives. So I'm gonna turn it over to Dan Janey with Fuss & O'Neill. They are the consultant that we selected for this. And on his team, he's got Dan Janey, Lindsay, and I forget your last name. Cavallo, Virgil Lloyd, also with Fuss & O'Neill. And we have Jim Gamesis
Yep.
with Camoin and Associates, who's going to be talking a little bit about tax incremental funding, which are called TIFs. It's just an opportunity that the town could have to really leverage some additional funding opportunities. So with that, I'll turn it over.
Sure, thank you. Sure. So I'm Ian Janey with Fuss & O'Neill, licensed environmental professional. I just want to recommend, he's our landscape architect, Virgil's our wastewater engineer, and Jim is with us with Camoin on the market funding side of the project. And we're here tonight to kind of talk to you about our progress on the Scovil Ho Mill project. It's a really interesting project that we're excited working for the town and the building committee on. And I think what we'll do is I'll give my presentation sort of on our progress to date on the project itself, and then maybe break and you guys can ask questions, and then Jim will give his presentation on the tax increment financing, which is a key component to the project as we think about the next steps. So just with the agenda, review the objectives in the background, really the existing condition assessment, discussion of sort of the information on the site to date, and then our analysis of reuse, which Lindsay and Virgil have been involved in, and then sort of a discussion of next steps. Just recognize our team. In addition to Kamoing, we have Kroski Architects on the team. So Bill Kroski and his group have also assisted us going through the buildings in terms of looking at the reuse options and also contributing to the reuse planning. So the objectives, the grant that the town was able to acquire from DECD, the historic grant, really was sort of twofold. One was to do an engineering and environmental assessment of the existing conditions of the mill and really sort of acquire information as part of acquisition planning to do the pre-acquisition due diligence. The second part was to sort of take that information and some of the other information that you've already done through the town and start to think about the reuse of the property and also start to hang some costs on it. And so you can start to do next step planning in terms of where you go from here with the funding. So as you know, just right there, it's a 4-acre site, former Scovil Hoe Mill. It was surrounded by Crandall Hillwood Brook to the south, residential use to the south, the west, and the northwest. To the east, you have the village, and then further to the northeast, the Connecticut River. So, as you know, the key features are the topography in this area, the presence of the streams and the water. Really, that contributes to the aesthetics of the site, but it also contributes to some of the reuse challenges, and we'll talk about that. The site itself, 2 buildings, approximately 18,500 square feet, built in the 1800s, used from the 1800s to the 1940s by Scovil Hoe Mill for the agricultural equipment manufacturing, planters and hoes and such. And then in the 1940s, purchased by the state and transitioned for use as a storage and truck maintenance facility. And that use occurred up until about 2014, and the property's been essentially vacant since that time. So what we looked at for existing conditions shown here, these different components, and I'm not going to give you excruciating detail on each component, but just enough sort of hitting the highlights. And really the excruciating detail is in these deliverables. Basically, a report was prepared for each component that we looked at by the different disciplines. I'll start with the environmental. As Liz mentioned, we did a phase 1 site assessment. So phase 1 is basically identification of areas of concern or recognized environmental conditions, basically the issues on a site where you could have a release of petroleum or hazardous substances. 19 were identified. Pretty much all of them were associated with the former DOT activities, although a few were associated with the former mill activities. And we'll talk about sort of these big 3 when we talk about sort of what it means. But polluted fill, underground tanks, former underground tanks, and former vehicle lifts. Those are sort of the key features, the drivers of what's going to drive remediation here. The next step after the phase 1 was to do a phase 2 and 3. That's the intrusive part of environmental investigation, collecting the soil, the groundwater samples, looking for the constituents of concern, the contaminants. At this site, it's petroleum hydrocarbons, volatile organic compounds, and metals, lead and arsenic. Those are the primary remedial drivers that are present at the site. This is our plan showing sort of the overall footprint. You have the brook here, north straight up, Candlewood Hill. This is our plan. All the dots basically represent borings or wells that were put in, our sampling locations. What we did was pretty much look at everything that DOT and its consultants had done in the past and then sort of built off of that and tried to fill in different data gaps. And I want to talk about 4 things relative to environmental to kind of take away. One, the site is an establishment under Connecticut's property transfer law. So what that means is, at one time or another, more than 100 kilograms of hazardous waste was generated in any one month. What that means is it puts the site in a condition when the property is transferred that it has to be cleaned up in formal accordance with the state cleanup regulations. Second thing, as many of you probably know, there used to be a pond on the site in the eastern portion, the former Spar Mill Pond. That's this dashed line area here. The Candlewood Hill Brook was dammed. The pond fed a flume that was on the southern portion of the property, crossed over into tail race, and fed a hydraulic unit in a former mill building, basically the area that's surrounded by the chain link fence. Over time, that pond was filled in, and it was filled in with various materials, debris, building materials, soil, etc., which is polluted. There's approximately 14 feet thick of the materials in the pond area. And that's one of the drivers going forward that's going to need to be considered as part of the reuse planning for the site. Second thing, in the building closest to the brook, in the eastern portion of the building, one of the things that we discovered from our work was a release of petroleum from a former underground vehicle lift. So basically they're hydraulically powered, hydraulic tank leaked, and one of the issues was the building itself has a lot of subgrade trenches for the old drainage associated with the mill. So those served as preferential pathways for the oil to get into the trenches. So a companion to that also, there was an underground tank system over in this area that also has some evidence of petroleum contamination. The bottom line is it's soil that's petroleum polluted. It can be managed as part of remediation, and it's an issue that will be carried forward as part of the remedial planning. Lastly, with environmental is the groundwater quality. So as many of you might know, the village has an impaired condition for a portion of it, and the town and the state have taken means over time to address that condition. So one of the things that we looked at in our investigation here was, could the property be contributing as an ongoing release of contamination to the overall aquifer of the village? So what we're looking for is really identification of free-phase products. So basically oil leaking from tanks, does that condition exist? Chlorinated solvents, so degreasers that may have been present at the site, is that still an ongoing condition? So the various dots were sort of targeted for those areas. And the good news is we did not find that condition. So there is no evidence of a continuing ongoing release, but there is evidence of issues that need to be addressed as part of remediation. We'll talk about that in a couple slides. So the hazardous building materials was also another component that we looked at. Our professionals went through the buildings, looked at asbestos, lead-based paint, PCBs. Bottom line with that is there are those materials present, although PCBs were not detected in building caulk or glazings, but asbestos and lead paint was in these materials. That information is summarized in our report. Abatement will be required as part of reuse for the site. The wastewater disposal, the assessment, we took a little bit of a different tact with that. We didn't evaluate the existing condition because there's a very small leaching field on the property now. It was sized basically to serve a bathroom facility for DOT. So going forward, that's not really suitable for reuse of what you are envisioning for the site. So what we were looking at is a system based on our concept design for the reuse that we were contemplating. And our target was less than a 7,500 gallon per day system, because over that puts you into a DEP regulated category with much more stringent permitting and such. So our design flow was about 7,000 gallons per day based on the reuse option that I'll show you in a minute. And we looked at basically places to put the leaching field, the site, and we also looked off-site. The site was actually eliminated as an option fairly early in the process because of the issues shown here. The urban fill, you can't build a system in polluted urban fill. The topography and the configuration of the site itself doesn't lend itself to the sizing for that kind of system. And the setbacks, the wetland setbacks, the utility setbacks, the drinking water locations, all kind of precluded use of the site. We looked at the elementary school as a possible option for expanding the footprint of the existing system to potentially accommodate a Scovil whole use. The system at the school is fine. The reserves are suitable. Expansion of that system to accommodate this flow wouldn't be allowable because basically the only area that we could see that the system could be sited is close to wetlands and the water table is too high. So we looked at the town green right across from Scovil as a potential option. One, it's obviously in close proximity to the site, so logistically to get the wastewater from the site to the reserve, to the leaching field is a lower cost as opposed to exporting it anywhere else. And actually the test pits that we did on the town green had really good soils in terms of percolation, so very favorable for infiltration and deep groundwater table. So So sort of the bottom line with the wastewater, because it is, and you'll kind of hear that throughout, that is one of the driving factors for reuse of the site and what can occur at the site is the ability to accommodate the wastewater. Obviously, we know that you've undertaken an initiative to start a village solution wastewater process, and certainly that is part of the planning for Scovil reuse, is if you can solve that and not have to have a standalone system for Scoville, that's favorable. But for the purposes of our study and the purposes for generating the cost estimate, that's what we evaluated, was a standalone system. The water supply, there is a water supply well in the eastern portion of the site. DOT reports that it's 120 feet deep, thereabouts. It's an 8-inch drilled well. The well visibly is in good condition. The pump apparatus is in place. It has entirely been disconnected by DOT, so that the piping and the electrical have been disconnected, largely because the piping inside the buildings, I imagine, is empty for freeze concerns. We did collect a groundwater sample from the well, had it analyzed for the constituents of concern. None were detected. The caveat is the sampling that we did is not suitable for permitting for DPH consideration. So they will require a long-term pumping test to get that well permitted for a community supply, typically a 72-hour test, and additional sampling. Sort of combining the structural and the architectural existing condition survey. You mentioned that the building's been vacant since essentially 2014. The professionals went through, there is in the report identification of, there's some water infiltration issues, there is some exterior wall issues, there's some degraded timber issues, but the bottom line is the buildings are in structurally good condition and can be reused. So one of the things we did was also sort of look outward a little bit beyond Scoville and think about a Scoville development in terms of what else is beginning to occur in the village. And clearly Scoville is right at a clear point of access into the village, a desirable location. So looking at sort of the constraints and the opportunities of how the Scoville development would occur, the constraints. I mentioned the water courses and the topography. The fact that they bisect the village and cut it up a little bit, on the one hand, it's a challenge, but on the other hand, it's what really makes the village aesthetically pleasing and desirable from a linkage point of view. There are a couple other blighted properties downtown that also serve as development opportunities. On the opportunity side, clearly there's a recreational asset. The fact what you've done with the Haddam Cove and positioning that as a destination is a tremendous draw. The fact that the properties that are developed largely are publicly controlled, so you have a say in how they're developed. The open space, the recreational aspect, clearly there is a lot of opportunity for the village. So the market analysis that Camoin did, building on what they had done previously for Tylerville and the jail project, really sort of boils down to one, your market segment that could be attracted into a village revitalization is an aging population looking to downsize, looking to live in a walkable community, a connected community. Similarly, young professionals looking to come back to town and having market rate housing that they can live in. So that lends itself to these reuse options. Sort of office, artist, flex space being key, so as things change, the space can change. The specialty food and retail shops, a restaurant of some kind, brew pub, something of that nature. If you remember from the Camoin presentation when we did the jail, they talked about a lot of market leakage out of town in terms of shopping and such. So again, this could be a way to attract that back into town. And one of the ways to do that is to attract with the housing component, either a market rate component or a luxury component for people looking to downsize but still have amenities. So with that, I'll show you the reuse option that we came up with. And similarly to the jail, we're not saying this is the only option, this is the best option. We're saying this is an option, and it's an option that we hung costs to and thought a lot about in terms of cost. Similar to the jail, we also thought about the building committee's criteria in terms of reuse, the sustainability, taking into account the character of the village. And sort of a little different spin on the jail, the sanitary flow limitation. Having a flow that is achievable. So this is the reuse. Basically, we're calling for the entire footprint of both buildings to be reused, all 18,500 square feet, office, artist, flex space, and specialty shop. I'll show you in another slide, but basically 5,000 square feet of the building closest to Candlewood would be a restaurant or a brew pub, something of that nature. Construction of a new building, 14,000 square feet, 3-story. The bottom floor would be a continuation of the artist, flex space, and specialty shop. The upper 2 floors would be residential. I'll show you a footprint of that in a minute. Just wanted to talk about the aesthetics of the property in terms of, this is a retaining wall that we're showing being built. The reason for that is to sort of grade out this area so you can accommodate parking. So this is general industry standard parking ratios we're showing. Sort of a companion parking with the town green and a little bit of on-street parking component. And then to kind of start the linkage of the village, a proposed pedestrian walkway across the brook. This is a footprint Kroski assisted with. So this is the blue is the restaurant, 5,000 square feet. This is the building closest to Candlewood Hill Road. The rest of the building would be flex space as well as building closest to Candlewood Hill Brook. It's hard to see, but the dashed lines here are flexible units. So as the tenants evolve, your space can evolve in terms of the sizing. This is the depiction of the upper 2 floors of the new building. So what this is this could be a single unit of 1,500 square feet for that higher end luxury condo apartment style, or it could be split into 750 square foot units for more of the market rate housing depending on the market you're trying to attract. So it could be a 6 unit or a 12 unit occupancy. This is hard to see here, but this is the footprint of a typical unit that Kroski developed. So some of the perspectives that they came up with in terms of the sketch model. So this is the new building with the upper 2 floors residential. These are the 2 existing buildings. This is looking to the west. And then this is the view looking to the east. And that's that retaining wall I was mentioning, so you can see sort of the elevation difference. And the reason partially is aesthetics, but partially proper site grading to make sure we can accommodate the parking. So what does this cost? So this is our order of magnitude opinion of cost. This is showing a cost breakout in an order of magnitude is a -30 to +50% range probability of cost. And this also has a 20% contingency built into it. So these are conservative cost numbers, and we will admit that. And at this point in the process, we recommend that you think in conservative cost numbers because of the unknowns that we're talking about tonight. This is just sort of the breakout, just so you can get a feel of the individual costs for the different components. So these costs are design, permitting, and construction cost estimates rolled into one. And one of the things I wanted to point out with the costs was for the environmental costs include the surface completions as environmental costs. So the sidewalks, the landscape, the pavers, the pavement, all those profiles, we're counting that, and we recommend that you count that as an environmental cost because in essence, your development is part of the remedial solution for the site. You're ultimately looking to cap that polluted soil in place if it's geotechnically suitable to do so. So in terms of the planning of the project, that was one of the main considerations. We just wanted to compare our, again, we're not saying that ours is the best or the only one, it's an option. And, we know, I attended the meeting that CTR C&D had. They're an entity potentially interested in the site. They contracted the Conway School to come up with some designs. We thought their designs were really innovative and had unique footprints. And really the message that we wanted to have a takeaway from this is, regardless of what the ultimate concept is that you decide on, it's very important that you consider the environmental, the wastewater, and the site design all as one consideration and all as one planning process. You don't want to think of any one discipline or component in a vacuum. And I think the easiest example I can give you is if you have a concept design where a footprint calls for tremendous cuts and you're generating, tremendous volumes of soil that you can't manage on site, you can't keep on site. Well, the soil is polluted, it has a cost associated with it. If you have a design that generates a lot of excess soil, you're going to have higher costs to dispose of that soil. So just sort of taking all that into consideration as this process evolves. No one thing can be done in a vacuum. So next steps. So we've done this effort. We have a really good understanding of the site. We have we have some ideas about what the site could possibly be used for in terms of the market and what the town wants. So where do we go from here? One, we have about $60,000 left in our grant. With that, we have several variables that are sort of ongoing that are kind of playing into the thinking about where we go from here. First, we have the property acquisition itself. The state owns the property. How is that acquisition going to occur? We have the environmental obligations that we've been talking about. Somebody has to be responsible for those. What does that mean? Obviously, the wastewater initiative that's ongoing in the town is linked to this. And then we have the gap financing, which Jim's going to talk a little bit about. But basically, we have a project that is going to cost a lot of money, and we need to understand that. So the first thing is a meeting with DECD. So Liz has scheduled a meeting with the Deputy Commissioner and the Deputy Director for July 30th. They're going to come and they're going to look at the site. We're going to talk to them. The site is actually on a DECD priority list of state surplus property. So it's one of 5 properties that the state previously designated as a priority property for reuse. What that means is it's been designated for priority in terms of the ability for DECD to try and market the property and bring it back into productive use. It's also eligible for some funding. So clearly talk to DECD about what that means in terms of positioning for funding. What's that process? When is it going to occur? The role that DECD might play in terms of advocate for reuse of the property. Those are some of the things we want to talk about on the 30th with DECD. Following that meeting with DOT, start to understand the transaction process. We actually have a little bit of experience, quite a bit of experience on another state surplus property in New Haven that followed a similar path. And one of the first things that was done was an MOU, a memorandum of understanding among all the stakeholders. So, in this case, these are the potential stakeholders. SHPO is the State Historic Preservation Office in terms of the historical considerations for redevelopment. Potentially CTRC&D if they're the entity ultimately that's elected to move forward. So really the purpose of the MOU is to sort of map out a blueprint of the process. Who's responsible financially for different components of the project, who's responsible in terms of ongoing operation and maintenance in terms of the environmental. So part of that, as we talked about, is the environmental consideration. So the site is an establishment. It's required to formally be cleaned up under the state cleanup regs. So as the process moves forward, starting to engage legal counsel to talk about entering the site in a state cleanup program. One of the possible programs is the Brownfield Remediation Revitalization Program. These are some of the advantages of being in that program and why an entity would want to be in that program. So just sort of the nuts and bolts, you need to be in a program before the property is transferred. So everything in terms of applying for the program and getting in it, you need to be in it before your deal happens and the property is transferred. And something as simple as the entity who ultimately will own the site needs to be named as a participant in the program. So just thinking about that, these are some of the issues that kind of have tripped up other deals that we've been involved with. A small thing, but you must have an updated Phase 1 site assessment as a companion to the application to get in these programs. Phase 1s only have a shelf life under the ASTM standard of 1 year. So it's simple enough to update the phase one that's been done here because there's no ongoing operation. But in terms of an update, one may be required depending on, when you're ready to do this. This is sort of what I've been talking about all along, the concept reuse plan and the cost estimating, regardless of what final design you wind up with, you want to go back and, as I said, integrate all the remedial options into your site design planning. You don't want to, bank on a cost estimate that was done 6 months before you had updated information on the extent of your stormwater design or the extent of your grading or if, the parking configuration changes. All these have to be done together. So in terms of the environmental, the design team, they all have to be coordinated. The public financing piece, when you get to the point of having an entity, a pro forma, basically the blueprint of how the site's going to be built, what kind of revenue is going to be generated, is there a financial gap with that? And Jim's going to talk a little bit more about that, so I'll kind of leave it at that, but clearly that's something that needs to be considered. So to wrap up, sort of the optimum situation would be a single transaction where you'd have the development entity in place. The property would transact from DOT to the town to the development entity, which would basically mean the preparation for Scovil would be completed. You would understand the pro forma, you would have that in place, you'd have your near complete concept design done, so each cost component is further refined. And the wastewater disposal option. As the village initiative moves on, the Scovil development needs to be updated based on that. Again, our concept was a standalone system, but that was for the purpose of the cost estimate. If there is a village solution, then the Scovil piece becomes a little easier. And then finally, sort of looking beyond Scovil, the village itself, in terms of starting to look, and you've done this, you're already doing this, look at the connectivity and how the linkage of all those development properties could occur with a Scovil development. And again, I guess I'll end with it really a big part of that is the sanitary and the wastewater solution. So, thank you. Happy to take questions or.
Dan, thank you. What I'd like to do is maybe we could start with the board or the commission and see if there are any questions from our members. Does anyone? Yeah.
Dan, just to clarify something, I don't know if I understood you to say that DECD may have its own interests in doing something with the property?
No, they are, so there's a special designation that was done by state statute a couple years ago for 5 surplus state properties that basically, it was prioritized that the state should move these on and have them redeveloped.
Yeah, I didn't know if that had changed, that was what I was asking.
Well, that's something we want to talk to it's still present. The question is there special funding set aside for those properties? What will DEC do in terms of helping you market those properties? The advocacy, the project we were involved in, DECD was an advocate in terms of facilitating the deal. It was a DOT facility that was transferred to the municipality, and then within 5 minutes it was transferred to the development entity. So DECD was a partner in that, so talking about them in this project.
And the other thing about the uniqueness of this property is that Connecticut Trust for Historic Preservation has listed these as examples of some of the best mill buildings in the state of Connecticut. So this is a unique site. Any other questions from any of our members? No? Okay, we open it to the public.
Are there any concerns about it being in the floodplain with it being so close to the stream we have right here?
Not concerns. It's part of the development of the site that has to be taken into consideration in terms of what's in the floodplain and what's not. So that's one of the issues why the leaching field is limited, is that you can't have that in the floodplain. Not from an environmental point of view. It's a consideration for part of the site design.
Any other questions?
Yes.
Yeah.
Did you include this building as part of your study, your environmental study?
No,
You did not. Second question, you say you sampled the water of the well. Do you have those test results available we could look at?
yeah, it's in our report, so, all of the reports. It's like the second slide. These were all our deliverables provided to the town. So the actual test results would be in the phase 3, the environmental site assessment. This would be here.
And that, Liz, you have that in the manual?
I do. I have the paper copy. I have to see whether or not I have a soft copy because it may have been too large to
Right,
email, but I can have that available for you.
okay.
Monday would be better.
Lisa?
I just was curious, it's probably more of a question for over here. Has the Connecticut Resource Conservation Development people pursued anything with respect to this property, other than having that study done by the Conway School?
I think they're talking internally. I think there is interest, and that's about as much as I know. I think they are interested, but no final decisions
Has been made?
have been made.
Because they seem to be sort of on a fast track with respect to finding a property, and they seem to be somewhat serious about this one. And I was just wondering if there's been any movement.
Of the properties they looked at, it's my understanding that this was the most favorable, that this is the one that they liked the most. I think part of the fast track was that they had a grant that they had a deadline to use. So I think initially they wanted to do something more in the southeast portion of the state, maybe on the other side of the Connecticut River, and they just couldn't find the right property. So I think in their mind, and I don't want to speak for them, they found sort of the ideal situation. They wish it was maybe on the eastern side, because when they did their initial analysis, that's where the absence was for this type of regional market. But as I understand it, they're going to pursue it.
So this is still on the table?
It is still on the table.
Ellen?
I may have missed it when you were describing the demographics of this area. Can you define what the geography is? How many people are in this? How many mile radius? I didn't see that in the...
There is here. Do you happen to know?
I don't think it's on that sidebar. I don't know it off the top of my head.
I mean, one of the key takeaways from what Des Moines had done with their study was the fact that really this, in terms of the population, median age, an older population, a population where obviously, single-family homes. So that sort of led to the opportunity of having more market rate housing as part of the reuse option.
I'm not sure.
That actually wasn't my question. My question is, what constitutes the market that these numbers are characteristic of? Is it 15 feet from the site? Is it 2 miles? Is it, there's usually a circle that you use to pick your demographics. Can you define that circle?
I think when you were looking, they looked at the town, they looked at the entire town.
It's on the Haddam, right?
The exception would be, so that's a good question. Now I know what, I understand the question. So it was probably a mix of both the town. However, on the retail side, that we probably we would look at the visitation and other retail markets nearby outside of town. And the conclusion, and I didn't do the market analysis, but our firm did, but knowing enough about it, the conclusion would be that the retail would be purely market driven. I mean, I'm sorry, excuse me, purely local driven, not like, not a destination in and of itself, based on the size of the site, the location of the town, and so forth. So, whatever retail or restaurant is there would have to be supported by local residents, essentially.
So when you say, and this is, you may have been a Freudian slip, this is a market-driven project, right? This is not a state, this isn't a government subsidized project. The rentals need to rentals that are generated need to satisfy developers' pro forma.
Correct.
Right.
So you need people. And I'm basically asking how many people represent this study? Is it 10,000? The local market of Higganum is 2,500 people.
Right.
This 2,500 people are going to support this project?
So let me just clarify, and again, Dan, jump in because you've been part of the project longer. It's not market-driven in the sense of today, based on the cost and the amount of remediation, there's no level of market that would support it.
Right.
I don't care if it was 50,000 people, because it's not financially feasible at this level based on the environmental assessment, the condition of the property, the location, and so forth. If you could get to a pro forma based on cost of the site that is available and ready for development, at that point, that's where it could potentially be market driven. But I don't.
5,000 square foot restaurant in this model. Someone's going to come to
But
that
That was
restaurant.
primarily based, the size of the restaurant and the number of seats was based on the ability of the wastewater. So that, the limiting factor of the restaurant is the number of seats. The number of seats was generated based on the wastewater flow. And the wastewater flow was based on what we actually could accommodate without getting into a DEP-approved system, which just wouldn't be feasible on the green or certainly not on the site and nowhere close to the site. So what really was driving the size of the restaurant is the wastewater.
And just to be clear, that it's not like today, and Dan, please jump in if I'm off base. It's not like today someone would say, hey, I'm going to put my restaurant or my brew pub there, because if they had money for a restaurant or brew pub, they would not be able to pay all the cost associated with purchasing the site and bringing it up to standards, including all the remediation. So there is zero market for any of this stuff today.
That's that gap, that financing gap that we're talking about.
Any other questions? Mike?
You know, really, he didn't answer Alan's question, though. I mean, it seems like Alan's saying, well, within 1 mile radius, how many people are here to support that? And I didn't hear the answer.
I just
Or
don't
2
have
mile
the,
radius or something, you know?
I just don't have the market study in front of me, I apologize, but in the market analysis would be what geography was analyzed for each of the different uses, including where that would be. So when you're looking at, when we say that there's going to be a market for aging population looking to downsize, and there's going to be potential market for people that are younger looking for multifamily or smaller footprint options that are walkable, that would be in the market analysis. I don't have it in front of me to be able to answer the question directly, but I can absolutely get that answer for you.
Mike?
I just want, would the
I'm
town
sorry.
have to affect ownership and liability, or would it just be a partner and stakeholder in the process as it goes on? What if the property is transferred? Could it be transferred, say, semi-quasi to the town and an independent developer, or?
I think that's part of the MOU that I was talking about, is to get that understanding, and that would be the conversation with DOT.
Any other questions? Okay, great.
Sorry, I have just one quick comment. The Commissioner of DECD as well as the Ombudsman have toured this site. I don't know if they've toured with the present committee, and they were very excited by this. I believe there was $20 million set aside from the amount that you were talking about. I think they've only funded 1 or 2 of the projects of the 5. And this was definitely one of the top priorities, as you mentioned. And I urge the committee, and the first selectman isn't here, but I will bring this up. I urge the leadership of the town to continue that conversation with DECD, because that is going to be that gap financing. That's a huge amount of money.
We already have that meeting set up.
Okay.
That's
Yeah,
the meeting
they've
that-
already, they've already been here, so, I mean, they're very
Yeah, I
excited.
mean, but in terms of what that, there are 5 other properties, so in terms of that $20 million, you know, I don't know what the status of that is. I don't know if they've allocated new money in the bonding for 2018.
I think also in that particular case, there's some disagreement maybe within the state, because this is actually held by DOT. I think DOT might like to see, DECD, excuse me, would like to see DOT kind of dip into their pot of money and clean it up before DECD expends theirs. And at the end of the day, the town wants to see it cleaned up, whether, you know, whatever pot of money it comes from.
All right, why don't we move to the next presentation? Thanks, Steve.
Liz, can we get a copy of the market study too? Is that gonna be online? Or is that online?
It can be. Is it, Dan, is there a
Yeah,
chapter?
That's one of the things I had up on the slide, is the market study.
Yeah.
But it's within the it's one of the chapters of the report, right?
Right.
Yeah, and again, the 2 questions that were asked about the size of the market are very good questions, so I'm not suggesting that those aren't the right questions. I just don't have the answer right off the top of my head, but we will be responsive and make sure that we get to you based on the different segments, you know, whether it's retail, housing, what was the size of the market that was looked at? Was it town, was it regional, or in some cases, was it mixed? So that's what the market study would typically be based on. I just don't have that answer off the top of my head, but they're 2 good questions, so I didn't want to be dismissive of the questions.
Could you just go back? I was a little confused. If you were to take a lump sum and say this project will cost X to build it into a shell, not necessarily the finish of each store or apartment, was that number 14 million? I wasn't clear when you had 50% and 25%.
Well, basically, the number that we came out with in terms of all the cost elements was in the area of $11 million. So minus 30 is 8 million, plus 50 was the 17 million, so that range. In terms of the accuracy of the number at this point, we're not saying it's $11 million to do that reuse plan. We're saying it's in the range based on the level of cost effort, the amount of, you know, research. We didn't go out and actually get quotes from contractors to, you know, put the pavement on the ground as industry standards. You know, we can give an accuracy or probability of minus 30 to plus 50. And then on top of that, that number has a 20% contingency built into it.
Mhm.
So very conservative.
If you took the midpoint of all of that just to create a number in my head, how much does that translate into the developed cost per square foot of rentable space?
It's about, in that range, it's about $280 a square foot on the low end to almost $600 a square foot on the high end of that range.
And how does that compare to a typical strip center of a new site
I mean, I
on
think
a
it
piece of
depends,
land?
it depends on what's in it, but I mean, the
I think
typical is.
if it's a brand new development, you're looking at like 250 to 300 a square foot. That's just brand new, this is renovation, so it's a little different.
Yeah. So that's what makes it, like, in other words, again, that's why not even, and again, please, Dan, jump in, but it's almost not even ready for a full pro forma because there's so much cost involved to even get it up to where it could be considered for a private deal, or at least an arm's length private deal. Not that something, there's always something that can happen out there that because someone has a passion for the property that you can't account for. However, if you were to absorb all of the costs associated with the remediation and getting that site ready, mitigating all the risks and all of those costs, before you even get to the point where you can do a reasonable pro forma on it, you're not there yet. So that's why I think the next steps were do if you decide to proceed and you're gonna spend the money on that, on the remediation and so forth, now you can start talking what would potential revenues be coming in once you brought it up to a sort of regular standard, if you will, of a piece of property that could be redeveloped. Is that fair?
Yeah, and I think even, we saw this with the jail, so, we have the restaurant component as part of our concept design. So the restaurant included, the cost for a commercial kitchen, and all the mechanical, the electrical, all that infrastructure for a commercial kitchen. It's expensive. So a different footprint with a smaller size restaurant, or no restaurant, it's going to have a much different
The
cost.
reason I ask is because in the reality of Haddam, there are alternatives of renting space. There's lots of space available. And if I was a retailer, if I were looking at alternative sites, I would obviously have to choose one based on the cachet of the building, the location, traffic, egress, and all the rest. I'm ultimately going to make a decision based on how much it's going to cost to run a business. So the question I have is really just a simple question. Is this without subsidies to pay for all of the remediation? Is this going to be a realistic development site, given the realities of the marketplace?
I believe, and again, I'll restate it, I believe, so your example is a good one. If I walked in with, let's just say $15 million, if just hypothetical, I don't think I'll ever see $15 million, otherwise I wouldn't be in economic development.
Would you spend it here?
Yeah, the question is, you mentioned it, if I've got that money, I'm gonna spend it on something that is market ready, where I can make a return on my investment, or, because I don't have to therefore go through the costs. So the idea would be, ideally, it should be market driven if there's gonna be a brew pub and housing and some level of flex, right? But it's not, that's not possible in the market today, because if I had that $15 million, I would spend it somewhere else because I wouldn't have to absorb all those costs. So then it comes down to a public purpose. Is there an overriding public purpose and the ability to package in what we call lasagna finance or layer finance, that it makes sense from a policy perspective to mitigate some of those costs so that it can be nearer to the market. Because right now it's not near market.
Okay.
But that's a choice. I'm not here to say you ought to be spending money to do things. That's ultimately your decision, never mine. And there's ultimately needs to be an overriding public purpose to do it. If it was sensible in the market would take care of it. Someone would have bought it, someone would have developed. So new development since the recession and mixed use development is happening all over the Northeast. But it's not happening at sites where you cannot make a 10, 12, 18% return on investment. But that's not to say that all is lost, because then it gets back to alternatives and the public purpose and what you want for your community. And again, I think Dan hit on this really well, there's not just looking at it individually as a site, but if you start to think about what it means in terms of the, for the lack of a better word, village, is that a fair word? Like a village or a district, and how it might fit into that. Is that helpful? I hope. Yeah. Okay. So what I'll do is, and again, this is probably jumping the gun a little bit about, like, you're not ready to finance a project, you've got lots of next steps, but there is a pretty powerful tool now in Connecticut to help with financing, and it's called tax increment financing. I'm going to just go through and explain it, talk a little bit about sort of what the components are, give you some tips if you decide to go down that path about how you would want to consider utilizing it. And just so you know, I'll jump to the end. A tax increment financing always needs to be voted on by the legislative body of a town. So someone cannot come in and simply apply for it. It's a town program that has to be voted by the legislative body. which here would be a town meeting, correct? Yes, so that's what I want to be really clear. I'm not here telling you to do TIF, and that's what the voters ought to do. It's really up for you to decide. I just want to make sure that you understand it's one of several tools, should you decide as policy that you want to go ahead and take on some of these steps and help mitigate some of these costs. So let me do that, and then I'll open it to questions. I'll give an overview. I'll talk a little bit about what TIF is, how you can use revenues. I'll talk about a district master plan, which is different than a land use master plan. It's a financial plan that overlays on a district master plan. And I'll talk a little bit about the process of approving a TIF, should you decide to go down that road. I'll give you some tips, and then we'll answer some questions. So just before I start about what a TIF is, just real quick. So I know the company was introduced, but I just want to introduce myself. I'm Jim Demesis. I'm the Senior Vice President of Camoin Associates. Camoin worked on this project as part of the market study. I did not, but my colleagues did. However, I work a lot on economic development financing, including TIFs. I've been doing TIFs for about 25 years. They were very, very popular in Maine, where I am from and live now, although I grew up in Connecticut and lived here for 22 years in Connecticut before being forced to move to Maine by my wife. So Maine had this program called tax increment financing. About 2 years ago, Connecticut modeled their law after Maine. There was a law in Connecticut already. However, it was not that widely used. It was a state program, not so much a local program. However, they created new legislation. It was somewhat based on Maine to make it more usable by the communities. Since then, I've been working probably with 8 or 10 communities here in Connecticut on tax increment financing. And then it's also happening in Rhode Island and Massachusetts as well. So I have a bit of a background on this kind of financing. It's different in each state based on the local and state policies and law, but it's got the same core principles. So what it is, it's a financing mechanism. You can use it to finance economic, or we're going to use the word economic development broadly, economic and community development. Projects like this would qualify in terms of the kinds of things that you can use it to pay for, and I'll go over that later, where you can say, we're going to create a district, and as we invest in that district with remediation or infrastructure, water, sewer, roads, whatever they may be, and I'm speaking hypothetically now, as we invest in those, that's going to bring in some private investment. The private investment is going to drive up some property values. And that's therefore going to generate more property tax revenues. TIF allows you to say, we're going to use some of that future property tax revenue, and as it comes in, we're going to pay off some of the costs associated with the development. And they can be public and or private costs. So you can use them to help the people who purchase the site, to bring the site up to standards, or to put in certain kinds of infrastructure. Or you can also use them for public costs. Let's say you wanted to do the remediation on the public side, or you wanted to upgrade your intersections within the district, those kinds of things. The critical piece that it's important for taxpayers to know is that it's not a new tax. There are things out there that are like special district assessments that are in addition to the regular property tax you pay. This site, if you were to use, or a district around this site, if you were to pass one, would still be taxed according to the regular property tax. It would be assessed according to regular town principles in the way that you assess property. You would apply the regular town mill rate to it. That money that gets generated by it would then be distributed according to a financial plan. And I'll talk about what that financial plan, but it's not in addition to the current mill rate that you have. And that's really important for people to know. So I won't go too much into it, but if you have questions, please ask. But there was an old TIF process. You had to have it be state approved. There wasn't too many of them. You only can do a project, so you could do a mill redevelopment or a site redevelopment, but you couldn't do multiple parcels. So if you wanted to create a TIF district for your whole village, or another example is, I'm working in Cheshire and there's like 4 different properties that they are combining in a district. I'm working right now in Bristol, they're doing an entire portion of their downtown, which is multiple parcels. You can now do that, whereas before you could not do that under the TIF law. It had limited uses. It was primarily used for large infrastructure projects. It's more streamlined now, as long as you are following the state guidelines in the legislation. You do not have to get it approved by the state. You have to approve it locally, and I'll talk a little bit about that process. You can do a district. It has different kinds of uses. You can do it for residential, for retail, for industrial, for commercial properties, as long as you are doing them in the name of economic and community development. And usually that means tying it into a district economic plan or a town economic plan or a feasibility study and a market study for a site. What can you use the revenues for? A lot. And some of this should sound familiar now that Dan did his presentation, but infrastructure, so things like septic, sewer, water, roads, utilities, land acquisition, the purchase of land, construction, demolition and remodeling, streetscapes, professional services. So if you were to create a TIF district and you've got to proceed with the environmental remediation and you've got to do more planning and you've got to do more engineering and more legal stuff, that can be covered in the cost of a TIF. Then administration of the TIF, you have to have certain kinds of accounting and checks and balances built into your processes. They're somewhat minor, but you could pay for those. You can do things off-site, and I want to be clear about that. So let's say you create a district around your village. That's going to be a special tax increment financing district, and you're going to try to achieve certain development goals, like redeveloping this mill. However, in the course of your work, you come to the realization that that might add more traffic and you got to upgrade some intersections that are outside of the district. Well, you can use the money to help finance those things outside of the district, as long as they are shown to be related to the development. And then this last one's important because I want to stress you can, and I stress the word can, you do not have to. You can use it if you're going to use bonds to pay for any of this stuff. If you're going to borrow money through municipal bonds, you can use the TIF to help pay back that bond. You do not have to bond if you are doing a TIF. So I'll give you an example. The town of Groton, Connecticut is looking to do a $80 million mixed-use development, and they want to help it occur in Center Groton. This has not been decided yet, so this is not exactly what's going to happen. It hasn't been approved, but it's all part of the public record because it's been discussed. In order for that development to happen, they need sewer infrastructure to the tune of $4.5–5 million. They do not want to bond as a matter of public policy. And so rather than bond for, if they did bond, they can issue a bond, pay for that, and then over time, the TIF would reimburse for the added property tax revenues would reimburse. However, what they're gonna do, what they're proposing to do, I should say, is they're gonna have the developer pay for the $4 million to expand the sewer, and then they're gonna give that money back to the developer over time through the TIF revenues. Again, these are policy choices. They're not necessarily what you have to do. What I'm trying to stress to you is that you don't have to borrow to be able to do this, and it kind of is dictated by the uniqueness of the project and the culture of the community and your own finances. So some of the things that, just to get more specific, roadways, water, sewer, public safety. I don't know if this would ever apply here, but I've been involved in TIFs where, oh boy, we're going to do a new development, but we would need a new ladder truck to be able to handle it. As an example, for public safety, that could be done. School cost, if you were gonna put in residential and that was gonna impact your schools, because of the kind of residential, you can help pay for some of those costs, particularly if you needed to expand classrooms or physical facilities. And then finally, this one definitely would apply here, but there's environmental improvement projects, so that includes all of your mitigation and those kinds of things as well, which clearly would come into play here. And I'll walk through this and then I'll take questions at the end. I know it's a lot because it is a technical program, but I'll try to keep it simple. So what is you have to have this district master plan. That's what the state law says. And what it really is a financial plan. You have to say, what are going to be the boundaries? Am I going to do just one property, or am I going to have a village district, for an example? And you have to be very specific about that. And those are based on your tax maps, your assessing records, and things like that. You have to state the kinds of things you're going to do and pay for with the TIF revenues. You can't just say, hey, we're going to take the money in and we may spend the money and we're not really sure what we're going to spend the money on. You got to have a plan that says, tied to a capital plan, an operating plan, based on a district study, those kinds of things that say we're going to use it for roads, sewer, so on and so forth. And you can estimate the costs. Realize a lot of these are future costs, so you don't necessarily know exactly what they're going to be, so you can estimate them. You have to specify how long you're going to keep a district in place. So a TIF district has a life from anywhere from 1 year, which you don't ever see them for that because it wouldn't be worth going through all the work to do it for 1 year. And it could go up to, based on Connecticut law, up to 50 years. You never see that in either. Who knows? I don't know what's going to happen in 50 years. Quite frankly, I'm not sure what's going to happen in 30 or more. It's more common. I think 50 was put in state legislation for certain kinds of properties that might be very, very large and require really long-term commitments in urban areas, for example. A typical tax increment financing deal would usually be no less than 10 years and typically between 15 and 25 to 30 years, depending on the project. And some of that relates to the infrastructure that you're financing. So if you're financing infrastructure, you're looking at and this is more in the engineer, your area of expertise, but you look at the lifespan of the infrastructure that you're putting in place, and just like you would finance it with bonds, you wouldn't finance a road or a sewer over 50 years necessarily. You would do it based more on the lifespan of that asset, essentially. So it's typically 30 years or less. You would have to specify in the financial plan the cost estimates of the projects. If you're going to go into debt, you have to say that this TIF allows the town to enter debt if it so wishes to. You can't just decide to do it later. You have to at least say that we are going to allow it. You have to say, and you have to estimate the anticipated revenue. So it has to be tied to, you can't just say, hey, we're going to capture the money, but we don't know how much money is going to be there. You got to make a good faith effort at estimating the revenue, which usually involves working with consultants, the planner, but also your assessor as well to understand what the market might do to assessments. And then you don't have to put the entire district into a TIF. You could have a district and you can say, we want to capture or use some of the revenue, but we're not going to use 100% of the revenue. We're going to use, let's just say, 50% of the revenue. 50% is going to go to the general fund, and 50% is going to go to a special fund, a TIF fund, and then, but you need to specify that in your plan, and that's what's meant by captured. So it's not all or nothing. You would specify how much. And then finally, that last one I'll explain. You probably are familiar with the term abatement, which is a Connecticut term where you can abate the taxes of particular kinds of properties or developments. Well, abate means, for lack of not using a legal term, but it's to refund a portion of taxes paid or forgive a portion of taxes paid. TIF allows you to do that in the district. However, it gives you another tool called the Credit Enhancement Agreement. You do not have to use this tool, but you can. And a Credit Enhancement Agreement would be, let's say you have a developer that wants to develop the mill, and they're going to put down $20 million to develop the mill, and they're therefore going to pay taxes on that new $20 million eventually when it gets realized in the assessment. You can say to them, for X number of years, we will give you a percentage of your property taxes back. In the case of like that Groton case, they're going to potentially give that money back to help pay for that sewer infrastructure that was put in place. But that's an example. It does not, you can use it just for public purposes if you want to, and you don't have to do what's called a Credit Enhancement Agreement. I'm just going to hit this really quick. It's really more for accounting purposes. If the town finance person was here, or those of you that are on the finance committee, this just shows the flow of funds. It really does show, again, money comes in from a TIF based on the formula that you set in place in the plan. Some of it goes to the general fund if you chose to do so. The rest of it goes to a TIF fund. Once it goes into a TIF fund, it gets divided up into different pots of money or purposes which are specified in the plan. The reason why this graph is so important down the road if you do a TIF is because you do have to show the annual accounting for this. The citizens need to know, the taxpayers, the legislative body, the administrators, you have to set up different accounts in your municipal accounting to be able to do so, to show what's happened with the money. I don't have too many more slides, but is it okay to continue going, Dan? Just a little bit long, and then I'll take questions. I realize I don't have great eyes, so I feel like that's probably not easy to read. So the process in Connecticut, let me just hit on the highlights since it's a little tough to read. You have to have a legislative body affirm that they're going to do a TIF and that this is a benefit to the town. And usually that would be based on our understanding of the project and its fit with our recent studies, our economic plan, our comprehensive plan. You tie it into policies and process that you already have in place as to why you want to do it. So there needs to be that statement. And you also have to be able to say that but for, and that's a critical 2 words for a TIF, but for a tax increment financing deal, this would not happen. So in other words, that gets back to, if the market can handle this and someone's coming to you and saying, hey, I got $20 million, I want to buy the mill and help, I want to invest in it, and I want to pay for all the costs, and I want to do all this work, and I don't need anything from the town, then you do that. However, this has to say that it's been shown and requested because without some TIF financing to mitigate costs, this would not otherwise happen. So you need to include that statement. There needs to be, and I always have to be careful about this wording here. The plan, sometimes it's called Plan Commission or Planning Commission, depending on the town. It has to be sent to them, the TIF plan, and they have 90 days not to approve it or disprove it, but to make a statement that it's consistent with the plan of development. I might have that terminology wrong, but I'm close, right?
You got it.
Yeah, and that's what they go yes or no. We have concerns because, but they're not the legislative body voting on the entire plan. That's what the town meeting does. Then you have to have a public meeting of everybody, and then the legislative body has to approve the actual final district and its financing plan. In the case of a town meeting, it would have to be approved at a town meeting, and then you have to administer it, and it becomes effective immediately. I'm going to go through this real quick. It's just, I did numbers. These are hypothetical. They're not based on your finances. It's not based on your mill rate. I just did one. We just did one to be able to show. This was just showing you that you start, just realize whatever the value is of a current property, that's still gonna generate general fund. So if you have a district and you create a TIF district, and in this case, let's just say the whole district currently is valued on your tax records as $14 million. That's not the case in the mill site, but let's just say it was a much bigger district. That's still gonna, let's just say it's $14 million times a mill rate. In this case, the hypothetical mill rate was 31.94 mils. What's the mill rate here? I'm not too far off then. Yeah. So that money, the $447,000 annually, would still go to the general fund. So the value that's in place prior to the start of the TIF still goes to the general fund. Now, quickly, 7.5 million of new development. Someone puts in a new upgrade to the mill, or they do something in the district, and now the assessment gets increased by 7.5, hence the word increment, tax increment. The increment is 7.5 million. That increment is above the original value. The total project is now worth, or the property is worth 21 million, 21.5, 7.5 million in new value. That creates 7.5 million times the current mill rate. But in this hypothetical, I just said, hey, you're not going to do 100% capture. Remember before I talked about the capture rate, and I said you can do 100% or less. This one was going to do 75%. So 75% of the new revenue generated by that 7.5 is $180 million. I'm sorry, $180,000 per year. So now that's an increment that's coming in that you did not have before the district was created. You're still flowing money to the general fund. That's what now is available to finance the purposes of the TIF district. So that's just a hypothetical example. I'm going to skip this one. You have to estimate your values, and you do that through a combination of looking at the market, but also working with your assessor. Oops, and I just blew it. There we go. A few final ones. So what is good policy with a TIF? Because I want to be really careful. I don't want communities to do this willy-nilly. Not that you would ever do that. However, it's not just, hey, let's go out and do a TIF because the state changed the law. It is, let's do a TIF because it fits with the needs of the community tied into some long-term planning. So you need it tied into a strategy of why you're doing it, what's the public purpose. It is a good policy to create an advisory board. And that could be an existing committee that you have or a hybrid committee, but they should be responsible for helping determine the district, educating the voters and the public about it, and then overseeing it as it goes along and reporting back to the legislative body. You need to identify public and private needs. Realize none of this works if there's not going to be private investment. So you don't have to give people money back who are making the private investment, but if it's public, if you had a public site, like let's just say you were going to build a new school or a new park, and it's not taxable property, it's not going to generate any revenue, so there's no need to do a TIF. There needs to be private investment within the district. It's not a silver bullet, so in and of itself, it's not going to, typically it's not going to finance an entire project. You're going to need other forms of financing. And if you're looking to private developers, you also don't want to finance 100% of their project, because that's sort of, if they don't have skin in the game and they're not putting a substantial amount of their own equity in it, you don't want to do that. So when you develop a TIF plan, you say, we'll help work with the developer, but we'll only deal with, they have to be dealing with 90% of the cost. We'll only deal with 10. As an example, that number varies by community and project. Couple other policies. If this is less of a problem in a small community, but if you were having multiple TIFs and allowing multiple projects and multiple businesses to get their tax refunded, realize what you give one, the next person in is going to say, I want that deal too. I want 30% of my taxes back for 10 years. So just understand, you don't have to say yes to them, but you need to be prepared that now people are going to expect that. So you have to be able to say, why did you do it here? And why does it fit with your plan there? So that's really important. I really do, this other piece is a couple more. You got to have a system for tracking it. I already said that about the flow of funds chart. Make sure that you can account for it. There is a trade-off. What you are doing, what you are capturing and using in the TIF for new revenues cannot be used to just say, hey, let's fund more of the schools, or let's fund this or that. That's not part of the plan. Now, because it's passed by the legislative body, it can also be redistributed by the legislative body. So if you create a TIF district, money comes into it, and you're finding that you have excess money, you can then vote to take the money out of the TIF and use it for general fund purposes. But I want to caution you and just say this, and I'm not an attorney, however, you can only do so if you've met the obligations of the TIF. So in other words, if you decided that you needed to bond and you have bonds to pay back, or you have a legal commitment to pay back a developer for costs incurred, you have to meet those obligations first before you can move the money over to the general fund. And then there is a limit to it, so sometimes the question comes up, why don't I just do this entire downtown? Like, in fact, in Bristol was a great example. New Britain was another one. They were creating so many properties. They wanted to do the downtown. They were all excited about TIF, but the question became, why not just do it? And the answer is, there is a limit. You can't have more than 10% of the like your taxable value of property. So you can't take an entire downtown with lots of value that represents more than 10% of your property and put it in a TIF. That's the state's way of saying, when they pass the law, hey, use this tool, but hey, don't go overboard. So let me stop there. This will be available. I'm fine if it's available and made public. I'd be happy to have that be done. There is also a handout on frequently asked questions at TIF that will pass out as well, but you can circulate that, post it on your website. I won't go through all the words there, but there were some of the words that I used. Do we have time for questions or anything?
Jim, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Can we start with committee members? Liz, did you?
I have a question. So we have something in Connecticut, and in fact in this town, called a fixed assessment.
Yes.
Which the idea is that you pay taxes on what the base is, essentially, like you said, and then there's a 3, 5, or 7 year situation where you can get part of those taxes can be waived, I guess you could say, for new properties. And the way that it's written right now is for properties that are contributing to the character and charm of how you like repurposing historic structures,
Sure.
things of that nature. Is this essentially the same thing?
So, bingo, you get an award, because that question's never been asked. And it's the first time I've been asked that in all these presentations. That is that's in current law, and that's still allowable with a TIF. In fact, you, as a matter of policy, can choose. You can still do a typical abatement according to state law, and you can choose to do that. Or you can do the fixed assessment, or you can do the credit enhancement agreements, or you don't have to do any of them. But yes, the answer on the fixed assessment is that you can integrate that into your TIF and use that as a method for helping the investor or the developer.
But actually, really what I'm asking is, this is a better question. How is it different? How is a TIF and a fixed assessment different?
So I'm not an attorney, but I just want to be clear about that. But I believe you can do it for a longer period of time with the credit enhancement agreement. So I believe fixed assessments, and the law is kind of long, and I can look it up for you too and get you the answer after tonight. But I believe you can fix assessments for maybe 15 years. I could be wrong on that, but realize if you want to go longer, then you need to do a credit enhancement agreement. So it gives you, it allows you to still do fixed assessments, it allows you to still do abatements, and abatements are restricted too, again, without being an attorney, I think they're more like limited to 5 or 7 years, and they're limited to certain kinds of uses like manufacturing. You can still do those within a TIF district if you choose to and make them part of your plan. Or the most flexible of all of these, if you want to, is the credit enhancement agreement.
I mean, yeah, so I'm actually not a fan of the fixed assessment.
Yep.
But the TIF is more attractive because it sets parameters and it has a process that is part of the town and part of planning and zoning, and it sounds like the Board of Finance would be involved. So
Yes.
it establishes a district rather than singling out a single property.
Exactly. Well said.
Okay.
Anybody else on the committee, before we go to the public, questions? No? Alan?
Once the town establishes a district, the district can be whatever the town establishes, correct?
Yes.
So if you would take the village of Higgins and you included the elementary school and the Rossi property and the town garage and this facility, whatever, once you establish a district and you apply for TIF status, do you actually have to have a developer for all the items in that district? Or can you keep on, say for instance, they applied and for this project,
Yep.
since we're here talking about this project, and 3 years from now, someone came up and said, I'd like to do something in the Rossi property, which is, if you know what that is.
Yep, I do.
Would that automatically qualify for this TIF status? Or does each project have to get reapproved as you go along?
So I'll answer that in 2 parts. Good question. And the answer is, when you set up the district, according to your plan, you will specify that. So you can say, starting from now on, the district includes these parcels, including the Rossi property, right? And over time, we will consider, according to these standards and criteria, assisting somebody with the development of the Rossi property and during the life of that TIF. So yes, the answer is you could, once you set up if you were setting up a district as opposed to just one property, you could use it, and this is what they're doing in Groton, this is what they're doing in New Britain, this is what they're doing in Bristol. It's multiple properties, some of which have development right now ready to go, some of which may be happening, and some they're hoping to happen. But they therefore have set up criteria that says, we as a matter of policy will help out this kind of development under these conditions. And so they establish that, and then they can, but they still, in their case, in the case of, at least in the case of Bristol, they still reserve the right for legislative approval for each of those deals.
So each subsequent project goes to the legislature?
No, to the legislative body of the town, but not the state, because realize there's no state approval.
So if the town is eager for development and they establish a low threshold for what constitutes an acceptable development,
Yep.
almost anything that someone wants to do, providing it complies with zoning and everything else, could be benefited by this program.
Yes, and that I just do want to build on that last point too, because that's a really good one. You can never use TIF to do an end around any other law. So you can't do things that are not allowed in zoning, that are other, like there's in your TIF plan and in the state policy it says, subject to meeting all the requirements of all other laws and regulations. If that standard is met, then you can do the TIF too. So it's not a way to do an end round of a zoning or something like that.
So just to build on, so when you talk about the capture and what increment portion goes to the general, or what distribution you want the increment to go to the general fund versus new development, in a case like that where you may have three or four development properties in the district, and only say one of them, say Scovil had a really viable entity, you had the pro forma, you really knew the project and what the costs were, and the other 3 you didn't quite know as well. Is that sort of how you factor the split in the increment? Whereas the certainty is you're putting less into the general, or less into the developer, the incremental piece for development and infrastructure. And, you know, if you knew exactly what you were doing, you could funnel more into the general fund because you would be certain of what cost you need, which is the reason why you have the TIF in the first place.
Yeah, and let me even get clear on that too, so that, because you're hitting on it as well, and I want to be clear. Again, these are hypothetical, so I'm not saying again, I want to be clear about that. Let's say that you're doing a development that's here at this mill, and you know, based on all the costs associated with it, you're going to say, you know what, we need a lot of TIF money to make that work. So that's going to be 40% of taxes reimbursed back to whoever purchased it to pay for some of those costs. That does not mean you have to give 40% to every other person that does a future development. Somebody might only need $1 million of assistance, and they only might need a TIF to justify the project going forward. It might be a 10-year TIF with a lot less money because you don't need as much public expenditures and they don't need it any or as much private subsidy. So but you have to set that policy up. Like in the language that you would approve, it would say we can do up to X%, but each one will be determined on a case-by-case basis within the district. So the only other thing that matters, the reason when you start to say, we'll set a TIF up and we'll prospectively let people do it, that's where the years come into play. So if you've gone, let's just say, under that case, you set up a TIF district, but it's not until 10 years from now that someone goes forward and says, I want to develop the Rossi property, just as an example. Well, if you set your TIF up for 15 years, there's only 5 years left now. So if you're going to do a larger district, you might want to have it be for a longer period of time to allow that flexibility. You can always amend it too.
Just to clarify one thing, from the point of view of the developer, is all of the money that he is paying considered a tax deductible real estate tax, even though some of the money is flowing back not in the town coffers, but to offset development costs?
I think it's funny because I actually asked for a legal opinion about that today and I haven't gotten the answer yet for a completely different project. Here's what I do know. So realize if you are going to get, let's just say a TIF is going to give a developer back 50% of their taxes paid on a property for 5 years. Let's just say that. They actually do pay the tax, and then they get the tax back. So it's kind of a weird transaction, right? It happens instantaneously. So they are getting their tax refunded back. The question I don't know, I do know that they pay it. I do know they get it back. I don't know if this relates to your question, but I don't know if that's all, that flow of income coming back to them. Two things. One is it's called a credit enhancement agreement because that flow of money coming back to the developer, they can use that as enhancing their credit. They can go to a bank and that flow of money is bankable. The bank will say, hey, we'll discount it for 50 or 60%, but we will let you borrow more, or their equity partners will give them more equity based on that flow of money. I don't know though, however, if that flow of money coming back to them is taxable or not, like at federal and state taxes. I'm trying to get a legal opinion on that.
Any other, Mike?
Does this go into an escrow account or some kind of a lockbox? And if so, would the town be able to invest some of that money prior or during disbursement? You know, so they get a return on the return, maybe?
So, I should have brought my attorney. I'm not an attorney. However, let me, again, as a hypothetical, and my background is in municipal finance originally, subject to state and local laws. So there's like arbitrage rule, like you can't be banking money and making a lot of money as a community, but the money does go into a fund. That fund is sitting there I just don't know what you can invest it in, but it's subject to your own, no different than if you took in bond money and you were gonna put that in an escrow account and pay for it. There's limitations on how much you can invest it in and how much you can make on that investment. But yes, and it does need to be, in other words, it's in that fund until the legislative body says it's gotta come out of that fund. Good question.
I thought you had a question. Ed?
3 points. The first one, you show an example of an increase of $7 million, which only gave $179,000 of more income per year. That's really peanuts. I don't know how much you could do with that, but that's something we'd be looking at here, maybe, in terms of increases. So that's number one. Number two, that money is taken away from the rest of the town. We've created a little community here who's going to be able to reinvest in their lab posts, sidewalks, whatever they want to do, but the rest of the town is going to have to come up with that money to pay for the school and everything. That's the way it's going to be looked at. So you're taking away some money from the general fund, obviously, to kind of be focused in one neighborhood. And a town as big as ours, infrastructure problem across the town with roads and everything else, and the school, I think that would be a problem as well. And finally, in a small town like us, I think the Board of Finance can do that work. You don't have to go through this big project. They could provide money for infrastructure, for other stuff that has to be done. They could direct the money towards what has to be done here, and the town meeting could also do abatement too. So those are my 3 points.
Very good 3 points. And 2 of them are addressed, actually all 3 of them are addressed in that frequently asked question that we handed out, because those 3 points always come up, and they're very good points. But if I may, I'll just address those real quickly. I'll go to the last one first. The answer is yes, you can do it. So in other words, you could, there's nothing stopping you from doing a capital improvement plan, putting aside money. However, TIF, because you have to do it according to the law, and because you have to have a financial plan, it has more policy rationale to it. So in other words, it's not going to be willy-nilly over time. A new legislative body comes in, and they say, oh, you know what, we wanted lampposts are a bad example. We wanted a road, but now this year we don't really want more of that road, so they only do 2/3 of the road. Well, 2/3 of a road could potentially be useless. So in other words, yes, you can do it. You can set up a capital plan. You could decide. You can't do a credit enhancement agreement. You are not allowed to do it. You're allowed to do fixed agreements, and you're allowed to do abatements. But remember, I told you that those are very restrictive. And for a project like this, for instance, that would not be enough to generate the kind of revenue that you would need to finance the project. So the answer is yes, you can do it, but you're much more limited, and it wouldn't be predictable over time tied into a plan per se. But very good point. Point number 1 is a really good one, and let me just try to restate it. In other words, you're saying that this is benefiting, it's taking money away from the general fund. So that's a really good point. So first, remember what I said. At first, you got to say, is there a but for? In other words, you're not getting any of that money today. That property, and I don't know who owns it right now, but it's tax exempt, isn't it?
DOT.
So 0 money is coming in now. I'm not, again, without getting into the details of the property, the market is likely not to invest in it unless you do something. Therefore, nobody is benefiting in the town at all. So therefore, if you decide to do something, you're getting new tax revenue come in. And then finally, yes, it's benefiting the people in the district, but if you tie it into an overall town plan, it's not just the people who live or work right here or wherever that district is. If it's a downtown, a village, it's increasing the economy, providing more housing stock, creating more jobs, those kinds of things, which benefit all residents and create more tax revenues. I'm not saying if it's done correctly according to a rational policy.
Well,
but those are good questions.
Well, the other part of that, because my question, which you answered, so I didn't ask it, was that, did it starve the balance of the town to channel the money to the district? And what you said was that, in your example, say that original $400,000 of tax that's going into the general fund would continue to go there. It's only the incremental amount of tax that comes in, and the TIF can be structured so that even that could be a percentage. So if it was 75% that went into this area here, the town in general would still be benefiting to the tune of 25%, which, but for the TIF, it wouldn't exist anyway. So it is a
Yes.
benefit to the town.
That's a really good way
A
to put it.
benefit to the entire town.
The other thing you would do as a matter of policy, and that raises this point too, is I've seen bad TIFs done historically when people didn't, they were new in Maine, let's just say. And they would say, we're gonna give a developer $10 million back over time. Well, now you set a number, and you better find that $10 million, because now you have a legal agreement. The way to word that is, we will give the developer back a certain percentage of the investment over time and not to exceed $10 million. So that way your risk is mitigated. If not enough money's coming in, you don't owe them $10 million. If they stop the development and only do a third of it, you're not on the hook for $10 million. So there's risk mitigation that goes into your plan and your policy. Good questions, though.
Do you have any other questions?
I do. All right, so I'm still having a hard time understanding. So traditionally, the town might go and say, gee, in order to foster development in our village, we need sewers. And sewers are gonna cost $10 million. And we can either bond or do a TIF. And either way, if you bond, you're going to get the money up front and owe it over time.
Yep.
And if you do a TIF, you are going to get the money up front and essentially pay it back. Why would you want to set that up with what are the benefits of setting it up with a private investor compared to a bond market?
So, realize if you're doing a TIF, you can still bond it, and then you're gonna use the money. And again, it gets to the fact that, and I don't wanna say you can't do it, so what you're asking is a very good question. You can set up a plan, you can do the bonding, you don't have to do a TIF, so you can do all the rational things that we're talking about in a TIF and do a bond. Now, some places do not want a bond, i.e. Groton doesn't have the interest in bonding anymore, or they're gonna bond for a portion, but in other words, they're gonna, not Groton, but another place could say, we wanna bond for a certain amount, but then we wanna also use other money for the next amount, and the TIF helps package all that together. And then the final answer is, it's all good, you don't need to do a TIF if you do all those other policies. However, if you are finding that you may need to do credit enhancement agreements with an investor, a business, or a developer, that's only allowable under TIF.
Like a public-private partnership?
Yes.
Okay.
But it's not that. What I'm trying to do is recognize what you're suggesting, and that's a good. So Old Line is asking that same question. They're like, we got some village improvements we want to do. We don't really know if we need a TIF or not. And so I think good advice for them is, let's wait and see a little bit, get a better sense of what you're trying to do, what you're trying to spend money on, what the public purposes are, and then fit the tool to it. So I don't want to suggest that you should go out and pass a TIF just because it's available. Not that you were saying that, but your points are well taken.
Melissa?
One quick question, comment and then question. So the bond, you're getting the money all up front anyway. With the
Yeah.
TIF, you're, piecemealing it. But question is, how many towns or municipalities in Connecticut have used a TIF? Is there?
Oh yeah,
like
good question.
number?
So very few, because the law is kind of new. So there were, and I don't quote me on this. I know I'm on camera too, but there was very few TIFs. A couple of handfuls of TIFs before this new law. New law came in place, and who wants to be the first one in, right? And so everyone's like, oh, I'll wait and see. Connecticut Main Street did assistance program where they would help people assess whether to do a TIF or not. They did that in the first year. So that's how like New Britain, Canton, they decided to look into it. As far as I know, there's about probably a dozen or less actual TIFs or TIF policies under the new law that are in place. Now that doesn't mean I can't keep up with them. So there may be another 24 looking at them currently that I don't know about. But the answer though is not a lot yet.
Any other questions? Okay, great.
Yeah, thank you.
so
Yeah,
much.
I know that's pretty technical,
No,
and
it's
you guys
great.
had great questions, and you know more about TIF than a lot of people in Connecticut right now. So.
All right, next on our agenda is next steps. And I guess if you're sitting here and you're listening to what it's going to cost to develop this property and what that's going to come out to per square foot, it sounds pretty bleak. And but there are options available that I think could make this a viable project. And number one is that the state of Connecticut should clean this site up. DOT contaminated it, and when we had our last meeting with Tim Sullivan, who's since moved on, my question to him was, if I owned a printed circuit board company and I were in these buildings and I contaminated them and then went out of business, would the state let me walk away without cleaning them up? The answer was no. I said, well, then why should DOT walk away and not clean it up? It wasn't a real good answer to that one. So the state of Connecticut contaminated it, the state of Connecticut should clean it up. So hopefully those remediation costs will be borne by the state of Connecticut. Certainly that's the argument that I know Liz Millardo feels that way too, and that's the argument we'll be making. But there are also historic tax credits. This obviously the TIF. There's gap funding by the Connecticut Trust for Historic Preservation, economic development grants. So can you enlighten us on any other monies or grants that might be available that would make this a viable project?
I think you hit the highlights in terms of the DECD funding, that it's a priority site. Certainly the historic tax credits would be a primary piece to the package. Potentially the TIF as one piece of that puzzle.
Right.
I'm assuming it's not an opportunity zone? The new ones that got passed?
Oh, not enough.
Yeah,
No.
yeah. So that's the other one that I was thinking of.
So the point is that these projects like this are being done all over the state on a regular basis. And they are doable, but there's a lot of moving pieces, a lot of components to it, and a lot of work's got to be put into it. That's what the building committee and the administration are working on. So, what we've got to see is when you put all the pieces together and you go out to see what interest there is by developers, who's going to be interested, what do they want to put in here, what's going to make the most sense, and can this thing be developed? But on the positive side, these developments are happening on a regular basis, and there's a lot of interest in old mill sites like this, and fortunately we have one of the best in the state. So I think it's worth the work that's going into this to see if we can make this a component of a vibrant downtown Haddam. Otherwise, you either board it up and let it sit there, or you bulldoze it. Neither one of which are really viable options, in my opinion. So that's why we're doing what we're doing.
I mean, I think the more that what we've done so far is in terms of compiling the information on the site is really just sort of narrowing down, reducing the uncertainty associated with development of the site. So the more information that a potential developer has when they look at the site and understand the conditions and such, that certainly moving the process forward.
Right, and I was involved, when I was chairman of the Connecticut Trust for Historic Preservation, I was involved with the site in Norwich, which was the old Warrigan Hotel, which is a centerpiece of the downtown, which if you walked in that building, you would say there is absolutely no possible way this building could be redeveloped. It was that bad. And a developer came in and put all these pieces together, and frankly, there are more pieces available now than there were available then. And that is now been completely redeveloped, and it's a centerpiece of the town. So these things can be done. I've seen them done. Buildings far worse shape than these buildings. So we've just got to play it out and see where it goes.
Is this a historic building, designated historic building?
It is, did we get the designation yet, or is it still in process?
I assume it's still in process, but there was an application put in.
If the developer wanted to enclose the street that separates the two buildings to get additional square footage, would that be prohibited? Forget the feelings about historic, but is that
It would
a
have to be ruled
possibility?
on by the SHPO, the State Historic Preservation Office. So I can't answer that, but it would be.
That would change the dynamics of this
Right.
from being a
But again,
Dixie project.
there's
to
ways
being
that you can
a
do
Needy
that.
project.
Yeah, there's ways that you can do that without destroying the historic character.
That's
So,
what
again,
architects
that's,
are for.
right, that's by the SHPO. So, okay, so anyway, that's where we're heading. Any new business to come before the committee?
Can I
Nope.
just go back to
Yeah.
what the expectation is for the July 30th meeting? How many, what is it, in a nutshell, that you'd like from DECD that day?
Want to know where they put this on their priority list, how much pressure, either they're gonna clean it up or they're gonna put pressure on DOT to clean it up. And then what would be the, you know, what's the word I'm looking for? The status of the building. In other words, is it gonna pass to the town? Are they looking for money for it? Do they wanna sell it? You know, we need to get a determination on that.
Yeah, the reason I was asking was because I didn't know if also DEEP was gonna get involved. This is just between DECD and DOT at this point, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, and DEEP has no
Not yet.
no say.
They'll be involved when the site's entered into a voluntary program, so part of that application process engages them.
And no cleanup costs would be borne by DEEP, would they?
No.
Mike?
Is there any sort of estimated or understood time frame for this, a project like this? Say, approval, obviously the approval project probably gets kicked around for 6 months to a year, and then development would start after that. I know sometimes remediation, that's a slippery slope sometimes. They find something else that wasn't there. So has anybody sort of estimated how long it would take to have a viable structure in town that would be paying taxes back into the community?
I mean,
We have more
it depends on the development process and really sort of the developer's will to get the project done. So like I said, you can't do the remediation in a vacuum. You can't have you can't say clean up the site and then the developer comes in and builds it, because what he's doing is integral to cleaning up the site. So, I mean, we just had a project, that it was a 2-year project. It was a very old, maintenance facility, 100,000 square foot building, and the developer's up and operational within 2 years. So it's kind of, the will of all the parties involved in terms of moving the process forward.
I remember when I was in Coventry, we were working on the Armstrong Mills in the center of town.
Yep.
Pulled out our hair for years and years. Just finally ended up moving, but eventually they put, condos or apartments down there. It was a really great project that they had going. We had a lot of trouble with the remediation. And finally, when it took off like a rocket.
Right.
So Are we still talking a time frame could be, 5 years, something down the road?
We've been trying, the building committee's been trying to move this forward as quickly as possible, because when Tim Sullivan was with DECD, I feel strongly that he bought into this. He felt that this could be a centerpiece of the entire revitalization or vitalization, depending on how you look at it, of Higginham Center. And knowing that the administration, there was going to be a new administration, as soon as Malloy's term was over, we wanted to get, because what he said to us was, I can't go around the state cleaning up buildings willy-nilly. I need to know that there's a purpose, what's the end result. So give me a plan, tell me what it's gonna cost to clean this up, what the plans are, whatnot, and then we can talk about putting the money in. So we wanted to get this done, this evaluation done as quickly as possible, so we could go back to him and he could say, okay, we'll clean that up and sign off on it before this administration went out. Unfortunately, he flew the coop. He's got a job in New Jersey now and he's gone. But we're hoping that his replacement will have the same feeling about the site, and we'll know that when we have our
In the
meeting.
meantime, the state is still maintaining it to some level anyway, is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, the building is buttoned up, yeah. Melissa?
Where and when is this meeting on the 30th?
It's on the 30th, here in the community center, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm gonna say 11. It's in the morning.
Okay, yeah, it wasn't on the calendar, so I wasn't sure what time, so if I.
It's not a buildings committee meeting. It's the first selectman, the consultant, and myself, and the deputy guy from DECD.
David Curtis.
Thank you. And he might be bringing some staff.
Since the new TIF rule was created, there's apparently a handful of districts that pursue this. Is there any existing TIF district that is trying to do, that is doing what we're trying to do? And is it worthwhile to consult with them on best practices?
Oh, yeah, yes, I would, it's worth talking to some, so I'll just give you some now, but I can follow up via email. Putnam is trying to do it with the Belding Mill, potentially, which is another mill. Canton with the Axe Mill. There's a good one to check with would be, and I forget the name of the facility, but it's in Windsor Locks, but it was needed a lot of work as well. So there's some that are more ready for market, essentially. So you want to talk to some more of those challenge property ones. And then I can send more via email. Your idea is a good one.
Yes, and I'm friendly with the Canton planner, Neil Pade.
Oh, yeah.
And so I'm in contact with him, and I can pick his brain or get some draft.
And John in Groton, too, the planner there. Forget his last name, I can't pronounce it.
He's new.
Yeah, Reinier, yeah.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank our consultants, all of you, for coming and for great presentations. Thank you very, very much for all the work you put into this. This was great, and thank all members of the public for coming and for your interest. And I'm going to have a motion to adjourn by...
So moved.
Now we have a second. All in favor? Aye. Thank you very much.
August, and we gotta be close to the 9th. Whatever the next